two people fell in love without realizing the truth written in their blood, and their child paid the price. 1957, Louisiana. A year the country remembers through polished memories, tail fins on cars, jukebox songs spinning in diners, the illusion that the worst of the century was finally behind America. Eisenhower sat in the White House. Elvis Presley dominated the airwaves. Television sets flickered with images of prosperity and order. But in the Deep South, far from interstate highways and newspaper headlines, time moved differently. In Terrebonne Parish, the land itself seemed reluctant to let go of the past. Bayous cut through the earth like dark veins, slow-moving and heavy, their surfaces broken only by drifting leaves and insects skimming the water. Cypress trees rose from the mud, ancient and patient, their roots twisting upward like grasping fingers. Spanish moss hung from their branches in long grey curtains, swaying gently, as though breathing. Locals believed the land remembered everything. Every burial. Every lie. Every secret pressed into the soil and never spoken again. This story was never meant to be told openly. It survived instead in fragments. In glances exchanged between older residents. In conversations that dropped into silence the moment certain names were mentioned. It became a warning passed quietly from one generation to the next, not written down, not recorded, but never entirely forgotten. The South in 1957 was still governed by rigid rules. Segregation was law. Social order was enforced through custom as much as threat. Family names carried weight, and reputation mattered more than truth. What you didn't say, what you pretended not to know, often determined whether you were accepted or quietly pushed aside. It was within this atmosphere of silence and unspoken history that the Fontaine story began. Martha Fontaine was known as a quiet young woman. She spoke softly, chose her words carefully, and rarely drew attention to herself. Those who knew her described her as gentle, observant, almost withdrawn. Her chestnut hair framed a face that might have gone unnoticed if not for her eyes. They were amber-colored. Unusually light. Striking in a way people couldn't quite explain. Michael Fontaine carried himself much the same way. Tall and reserved, shaped by years of physical labor and early responsibility. He wasn't talkative, but when he did speak, people listened. And like Martha, he possessed those same amber eyes, clear, watchful, and unsettlingly familiar. They met in 1955 at a parish fair. The air that night was thick with humidity and the smell of fried dough and spilled beer. Lanterns hung above the midway, casting uneven light over spinning rides and clustered crowds. Music drifted from a small stage somewhere beyond the booths. Across the fairgrounds, Martha noticed Michael. Not because he was loud. Not because he stood out. But because he felt familiar. When their eyes met, something passed between them that neither could name. It wasn't excitement or nervousness. It was recognition. A strange, immediate sense of knowing. They talked easily. Too easily. Conversation flowed without effort. They laughed at the same moments. Fell quiet at the same time. When one paused mid-sentence, the other seemed to know exactly how to finish the thought. Friends noticed. It was like they'd known each other forever, one acquaintance later recalled. Martha would eventually describe the feeling in simpler terms. There was something about him, she said. Like I'd known him my whole life. What neither of them understood was that this familiarity wasn't coincidence or fate. It was biology. They had entered the world together in 1932, twins born during the height of the Great Depression to a 19-year-old woman named Eloise Thibodeau. Unmarried. Isolated. With no stable income. 2 infants were more than she could keep alive. In rural Louisiana at the time, informal adoptions were common. Babies were placed quickly, quietly, often without proper documentation. Names were changed. History simplified. Survival mattered more than accuracy. Martha was placed with the Hirt family in Lafayette Parish. Michael was sent to distant Fontaine relatives in Houma. Each grew up believing the same carefully constructed lie, that their birth mother had died during childbirth. Dr. Eleanor Whitman, a historian who later studied cases like this, explained that such separations were tragically routine during economic hardship. Record-keeping was secondary, she said. No one imagined these children would grow up and unknowingly cross paths. By the time Martha and Michael met as adults, every trace connecting them had been erased. Their relationship moved quickly. There was no hesitation, no doubt. They married in the spring of 1956 and settled into a modest home on the outskirts of Houma. It wasn't much, a small house, quiet evenings, simple routines, but it was theirs. Neighbors noticed how alike they were. They walked the same, recalled Mabel Guidry, who lived nearby. Same posture. Same way of standing still. I thought it was sweet. Others commented on how they finished each other's sentences. How they shared the same temper, the same silences, the same habits. No one questioned it. When Martha became pregnant later that year, joy filled the house. Plans were made. Names discussed. A future imagined without fear. In January 1957, their son was born. And the room went silent. The silence in the delivery room did not arrive suddenly. It crept in. One moment there was movement, gloved hands working quickly, quiet instructions exchanged between nurses, the familiar urgency of childbirth. Then Robert Fontaine entered the world, and the room seemed to lose its breath. Dr. James Teo froze. He had delivered hundreds of babies over the course of his career. He had seen complications. He had seen tragedy. But what lay in front of him defied anything his experience had prepared him for. The infant's face was severely malformed. The cleft palate extended far beyond anything medically typical, distorting the structure of his mouth and jaw. His skull appeared misshapen, uneven in a way that suggested deeper abnormalities beneath the skin. When the nurses examined his hands, they paused, 6 fingers on each one. Perfectly formed, yet unmistakably wrong. His lower body revealed even more cause for alarm. The legs were partially fused, limiting movement and circulation. When the doctor placed a stethoscope against the child's chest, the heartbeat was irregular. Weak. Straining. Dr. Teo documented everything with clinical precision, but his notes betrayed his shock. Extensive congenital anomalies. Severe craniofacial deformities. Cardiac irregularities inconsistent with viability. In 30 years of practice, he had never seen such an extreme combination of defects in a living infant. The nurses exchanged glances. One of them quietly wiped tears from her face. Another stepped out of the room without explanation. Someone called for the chaplain. Robert was not expected to survive the night. Martha, still exhausted from labor, sensed something was wrong before anyone spoke to her. The room felt different. Heavier. When she asked to see her baby, the nurses hesitated. Michael stood frozen near the wall, watching the medical staff move with a kind of restrained urgency that no one explained. When they finally brought Robert to Martha, he was wrapped tightly, his face partially obscured. She noticed immediately that his breathing was labored. Shallow. Uneven. But she held him anyway. "He's beautiful," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The night passed. Then another. Robert did not die. By the end of the week, the hospital staff was quietly unsettled. The child who should not have lived was still breathing. Still clinging to life despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him. Word spread, not publicly, but professionally. Specialists from across Louisiana began arriving under the pretense of consultation. Pediatricians. Cardiologists. Surgeons. They gathered at Robert's bedside, studying him carefully, speaking in low voices, reviewing charts late into the night. They recognized the pattern almost immediately. This was not a single defect. Not a random anomaly. This was systemic. Dr. Victor LeBlanc recorded his observations in February of 1957. The constellation of abnormalities pointed to extreme genetic homozygosity, an unusual concentration of identical genetic material inherited from both parents. In simpler terms, Robert's body had received the same genetic instructions twice. In the 1950s, the science of genetics was still emerging. DNA had only recently been identified as the carrier of hereditary information. But physicians understood enough to recognize that what they were seeing should have been statistically impossible, unless the parents were closely related. Meanwhile, Martha and Michael were facing a different kind of reality. Back in Houma, whispers had begun to follow them. Neighbors talked. Some avoided eye contact. Others crossed the street when Martha passed with the covered baby carriage. Rumors spread quickly in a small town, stories of curses, punishment, divine judgment. Few people had actually seen Robert. Many claimed to know exactly what was wrong with him. They acted like the baby was something you could catch, recalled Josephine Boudreau, a family friend who refused to abandon them. Like misfortune was contagious. Martha rarely left the house. When she did, she felt eyes on her. Judging. Measuring. Deciding what kind of person she must be to deserve this. Robert's condition worsened as the weeks passed. His heart struggled under the strain of his growing body. Episodes of respiratory distress became more frequent. Local doctors admitted they had reached the limits of what they could do. In March, the decision was made to transfer Robert to Charity Hospital in New Orleans. There, the investigation deepened. Hospital social worker Clara Washington was assigned to the case. Part of her role was to help the young parents navigate the medical system, apply for assistance, and document family histories, standard procedure for pediatric cases involving severe congenital conditions. Almost immediately, she noticed inconsistencies. Both Martha and Michael claimed to be only children. Both described childhood homes that sounded uncannily similar, despite being in different parishes. Both shared the same birth date. Both had been told their birth mother died in childbirth. Individually, none of these details were alarming. Together, they were impossible to ignore. As Washington probed gently, she uncovered another troubling overlap. Both parents had been born in the same small maternity home, St. Mary's, a facility that had closed its doors in 1935. When she brought her findings to Dr. Harold Jenkins, Chief of Pediatrics, his response was immediate. Blood typing was ordered for the entire family. In the 1950s, blood analysis was the closest thing medicine had to genetic testing. It could not reveal DNA sequences, but it could expose improbable similarities. The results came back identical across all testable factors. For unrelated individuals, the odds of such a match were astronomically low. Behind the closed doors of Charity Hospital, a realization began to take shape, quietly, carefully, and with growing dread. A medical mystery was becoming something far worse. While doctors debated behind closed doors, Martha remained at Robert's bedside. Hours blurred into days. Every shallow breath, every small movement, became a marker of both hope and dread. She learned the rhythms of her child's body, how to position him so he could breathe more easily, how to suction his airway, how to adjust the blanket so his limbs were not trapped by their own malformations. She sang to him, softly, almost mechanically at first, then with a tenderness that belied the horror of what she saw. Her voice floated above the hum of machines and the soft beeping of the monitor, a lullaby from a world where innocence and tragedy collided. To her, he wasn't broken, remembered Nurse Evangeline Mouton. He was her baby. Nothing else mattered. Not the stares, not the whispers, not the doctor's worry. To her, he was perfect. Michael worked in parallel, fighting the external pressures of the world. He labored double shifts at the lumber mill, the rhythmic pounding of hammers and saws a counterpoint to the silent anguish of the hospital rooms. Each evening, he returned with small gifts, sometimes a tiny stuffed bear, sometimes colorful ribbons to hang near Robert's crib, or flowers picked from the roadside that smelled faintly of rain and dust. These gestures, however small, were lifelines, tiny pieces of normalcy stitched into a life that had already begun under the shadow of tragedy. Yet the medical team was quietly building a storm behind the hospital walls. In April 1957, Dr. Harold Jenkins convened a private meeting with hospital administrators, the legal counsel, and an ethicist from Tulane Medical School. Their findings left no room for doubt. Martha and Michael were not merely compatible, not merely similar. They were biological twins. The question arose, should the parents be told? Ethicists debated the potential cruelty of disclosure. Could it be fair to reveal such a truth when the young couple was already navigating the impossible reality of their son's life? On the other hand, medical necessity argued for transparency. Knowledge could shape decisions, perhaps prevent further tragedies. Meanwhile, Robert's condition teetered on a knife's edge. His heart, already compromised from birth, began failing again. Doctors attempted unprecedented interventions, procedures never before tried on such a fragile, uniquely afflicted body. Throughout it all, Martha and Michael remained unaware of the suspicions that hovered over them. Their attention was absolute, entirely devoted to Robert's fragile existence. By early May, Robert had stabilized enough that Dr. Jenkins determined it was time to reveal the truth. He requested a private meeting with the couple, accompanied by Clara Washington and Father Thomas Barron, the hospital chaplain, for emotional support. Dr. Jenkins later admitted to colleagues that it was the most difficult conversation of his career. How do you tell someone that their beloved child suffers because of a truth they could not have known, he reflected. How do you reveal that their entire marriage exists in violation of both nature and law? When the meeting began, Dr. Jenkins explained the basics of Robert's genetic condition in terms accessible to non-specialists. He described how certain traits appear when a child inherits identical genetic material from both parents and how this was exponentially more likely in cases of consanguinity. He paused, letting the words settle. Martha understood before he had even finished. She went pale. Her hands trembled as she whispered, almost to herself, "We're related, aren't we?" What followed was a careful unraveling of their histories. Blood work results were shown, with charts and typed summaries that left no room for doubt. Clara Washington shared her findings, tracing each thread back to St. Mary's maternity home, the birthplace of twins born to Eloise Thibodeau on August 17, 1932. A girl. A boy. Separated at birth. Assigned to different families. Each family unaware of the other child's existence. Michael refused to accept it at first. "There must be a mistake," he repeated, his voice strained, shaking. "The records, they can't be right." Martha, in contrast, sank into quiet reflection. And then, in words that would later be recounted by Father Barron as haunting in their simplicity, she said, "That's why I felt like I'd known you my whole life." The documentation was irrefutable. The genetic truth, long buried by circumstance and human oversight, had emerged. Their love, the foundation of their brief marriage, was built on a bond neither of them had been equipped to recognize. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Michael was found hours later, weeping alone in the hospital chapel. Martha retreated into a silent trance, sitting beside Robert's crib, performing the tasks of care with automatic precision, barely speaking, barely moving beyond the routine of survival. Dr. Eleanor Westfield, the psychiatrist called in to assist the family, later reflected, "The human mind isn't designed to process trauma in layers so deep, so simultaneously personal and existential." They faced loss, guilt, identity collapse, and societal condemnation all at once. Legal ramifications followed swiftly. Under Louisiana law, marriage between siblings was invalid. Questions emerged regarding Robert's custody, inheritance, and the potential liability of the hospital for disclosure. Through all this, Robert's fragile body continued to struggle. Heart complications worsened. Every day was measured against the cruel calculus of survival versus suffering. The young parents, already reeling from revelation, faced the impossible task of making decisions with a clarity that grief and shock rendered almost unattainable. Yet even in the middle of unspeakable sorrow, their devotion to Robert never wavered. Martha sang. Michael labored. They navigated the whispers, the stares, the unspoken judgment with courage that could not erase the tragedy but allowed them to face it with. By June of 1957, the medical team at Charity Hospital had reached a point of grim clarity. Further interventions could only prolong Robert's suffering. His heart, already fragile and malformed, could not support the growth his body demanded. Martha and Michael faced the unthinkable decision that no parent should ever have to make. They would shift their focus from saving Robert's life to ensuring his remaining time was as comfortable and gentle as possible. In the quiet of the hospital room, they held him. Martha cradled Robert against her chest, her voice soft, murmuring lullabies that carried the weight of both love and grief. Michael sat beside her, his hand on the small, fragile chest that had beaten so bravely for nearly 6 months. The hospital chaplain, Father Thomas Barron, whispered prayers, the words mingling with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft whimpers of a life too delicate for the world it had entered. Robert Fontaine passed away on June 22, 1957, barely 6 months old. His last breaths were unremarkable to anyone but the parents who loved him fiercely, silent, measured, and yet final. He left behind a world changed by his existence, a medical community shaken by the implications of his condition, and parents forever altered by the revelation of truths they could never have known. The funeral was private, attended by a small handful of hospital staff who had grown close to the family. Robert was buried in a modest cemetery on the outskirts of New Orleans. His headstone bore only his name and dates, a small, stark testament to a life filled with extraordinary struggle in such a short time. For Martha and Michael, grief was not a simple thing. They were confronted not only by the loss of their child but by the unraveling of their identities, their marriage, and the understanding of their place in the world. Their union was legally void under Louisiana law. Their home, once filled with anticipation and quiet hope, had become a locus of whispered judgment and invasive curiosity. They were forced to confront questions for which there were no guidelines, no textbooks, no precedent. It was in this precarious moment that Clara Washington, the social worker who had guided them through the hospital bureaucracy, located Eloise Thibodeau, their birth mother. Now in her 40s and living in Baton Rouge, Eloise had rebuilt her life after the painful decision to surrender her twins during the Depression. The hospital arranged a careful, managed meeting in late July. Records describe it as emotionally complex, fragile, and ultimately healing. Eloise spoke candidly about her circumstances, how, at 19, destitute and unmarried, she had been unable to care for twin infants during the harshest years of the Depression. She had prayed every day that her children would find happiness and safety, unaware that fate would reunite them in the most tragic of ways. "I thought about you every day of my life," she told them. "I prayed that whoever took you in would tell you about each other someday. I never imagined something like this could happen." This meeting gave Martha and Michael crucial context. It could not erase the trauma they had endured. It could not bring back their son. But it provided the first real connection to their biological history, a framework to understand the collision of love, loss, and identity that had so violently shaped their lives. By August, practical decisions had to be made. Their marriage could not continue under the law. Yet the bond between them, both biological and emotional, made conventional separation feel impossible. What do you do when the person who knows your pain most intimately is the one person society says you cannot be close to? Martha asked Dr. Westfield during counseling sessions. "We lost our son. Must we also lose each other?" Recognizing the inadequacy of standard solutions, the medical and social service teams developed an unprecedented plan. Legal documents redefined Martha and Michael as siblings rather than spouses. Housing was arranged in Baton Rouge, with adjacent apartments that allowed them to maintain proximity without violating legal or societal expectations. Their relationship was recategorized but not severed, a recognition that trauma bonds cannot be erased by laws or social convention. Martha returned to work, securing employment as a hospital records clerk, while Michael found steady construction work. They rebuilt lives side by side, not as husband and wife, but as brother and sister, navigating grief while discovering the nuances of their twin connection. Their case, though confidential at the time, became a cornerstone study in medical ethics programs across the country. Anonymized documentation later became known as the Turabone case, widely cited as one of the first comprehensive studies of genetic consanguinity and its ethical implications in medical literature. It demonstrated, with tragic clarity, that family history is not merely supplementary information, it is essential medical data. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, medical professionals quietly shared the implications of the case, reshaping the field of genetic counseling in the American South and eventually nationwide. Dr. Jenkins, deeply affected by the events he had witnessed, dedicated the remainder of his career to establishing formal protocols for documenting family histories and genetic risk, practices that have since saved countless families from similar tragedies. Martha and Michael's personal lives continued in parallel. They maintained adjacent apartments, shared Sunday dinners, attended church together, and supported each other through illness and hardship. Neighbors described their bond as extraordinarily close yet entirely appropriate to their biological relationship. It was a delicate balance, love and care transformed from marriage into a sibling partnership, redefining the boundaries of connection. Martha eventually earned her nursing degree in 1964, specializing in pediatric care. Her experience gave her a profound empathy for families with children suffering from congenital conditions. She never disclosed her personal history to patients, but colleagues noted a quiet wisdom in her presence, a depth of understanding that could only come from lived experience. Michael, meanwhile, became involved with church-based programs for orphaned and abandoned children. By 1967, he was the director of a program focused on ensuring siblings remained connected even when separated by adoption, a philosophy directly influenced by his own tragic experience. His advocacy changed the lives of dozens of children, giving them a chance at connection that the system had once denied him. In 1972, 15 years after Robert's death, Martha and Michael established the Robert Fontaine Memorial Fund, providing financial support to families traveling for specialized pediatric care. Their tragedy was transformed into purpose, a living legacy that honored their child's memory while helping others avoid the pain they had endured. By the mid-1970s, advances in genetic science had progressed significantly. The mechanisms behind Robert's condition were better understood, and screening for recessive genetic disorders became more sophisticated. Martha participated anonymously in research studies, providing blood samples that contributed to the development of early screening tools, helping prevent similar tragedies for future generations. Their story represents one of the most profound examples of how hidden family histories can resurface with devastating consequences, and how medical ethics, compassion, and scientific progress evolved to address such complexities. The twins who married without knowing each other's origins did not merely create a medical anomaly. They left a legacy, a system of care, awareness, and intervention that has safeguarded countless families from preventable suffering. They proved that blood remembers, that love endures, and that tragedy, however overwhelming, can be transformed into a force for good. Even in the shadow of grief, Martha and Michael found a way to exist, side by side, honoring their child and the truths of their shared history. Their lives, though forever altered, became a testament to resilience, to the enduring power of connection, and to the capacity of human beings to find purpose after unimaginable loss.